This is Living Power with Dan Hurst.
Do you ever feel like your life didn't amount to much? Do you ever feel like things just weren't going the way they're supposed to go? You're going to fall in love with a man named Abraham. We've been studying in Genesis, and for the past several weeks been taking a look at Noah. I love the study of Noah because Noah was so much like so many of us. We tend to think of these guys as these incredibly deep, spiritual, holy men. Noah was a guy like you and me. And Noah, after having gone through this incredible spiritual experience of spending a little over a year on an ark that God had told him to build, and sure enough, the rains came, and sure enough, flooded the whole world, and sure enough, the ark saved him and his family, and he had all of these animals, and not knowing what was going to happen, how long he was going to be on the boat, just trusting God because God said to do it, and he did it. He just simply obeyed. That was all there was to it. It wasn't because he had this incredible spiritual insight to what God's will is. God just said do it, and he did it. And he survived. And after that, he had this great worship experience, and then after that, he got drunk. Fell apart, embarrassed himself in his tent. And the last thing that we see about Noah is this, what a way to be remembered. You know? I mean, what a way to be remembered. He just had this, he just tied one on. And embarrassed himself in front of his kids. So much so that his kids had to take rather sensitive actions to try to cover up. And then we looked at how God takes us into this transition, and the genealogy that we see is how important Noah was, and Noah didn't know it. Noah did not know how critical he was to God's plan and God's purpose. It made no sense to him whatsoever. Noah had no idea that the lineage of the Messiah was going to come from him. He didn't know. He had no concept of that. So now we finish with Noah, and we move through chapter 11, and you'll see this genealogy in chapter 11. I'm not going to get into it. It is kind of interesting. It's especially interesting to reflect back as we get into other people. We begin studying their lives, and we look back and see where they fit into that genealogy, into that chain. But now we're introduced to Abraham. And Abraham was one of these unique guys that you're going to learn so much about. But his life was so unique in that he was the person that God chose to use to begin expressing how he wanted to work in individuals' lives and what he wanted to do. And you're going to fall in love with Abraham. Let's take a look at Genesis chapter 11, beginning with verse 27. This is the account of Terah. Terah became the father of Abram and Nahor and Haran. And Haran became the father of Lot. Now you know, you've heard about Lot and Abraham. Well, they were cousins and apparently pretty good friends. Verse 28, while his father Terah was still alive, Haran died in Ur of the Chaldeans in the land of his birth. That was down in southern Mesopotamia. We'll see a map here in just a few moments. Abram and Nahor, those are the two brothers now, both married. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai. And the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. She was the daughter of Haran. And the father of both Milcah and Yiscah is really how you say that. Now, Sarai was barren. She had no children. Terah took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarah, the wife of the son of Abraham. And together the wife of his son Abram, and together they set out from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. Now notice this, they were on their way to Canaan, promised land, remember? I mean, they didn't know it was a promised land, but that's where God was eventually going to lead them. So they're going to Canaan, but they settled in Haran. They stopped. They didn't make it all the way. Terah lived 205 years, and he died in Haran. The Lord said to Abram, leave your country your people and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. And I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So Abram left, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. So for the first 75 years of his life, Abram grows up in Ur of Chaldea, then eventually moves to Haran. And so the first 75 years of his life, that's where he's been. Now, you'll notice that Abraham and Sarah are referred to as Abram and Sarah in chapters 11, actually through 16, until God changes his name in chapter 17. Now, A-B, is the Hebrew word for father. And in fact, Abram means exalted father. That's the literal meaning of the word Abram. Later, when God changed his name to Abraham, it meant father of multitudes. Sarah's name, Sarai, was later changed to Sarah, and it means the same thing. Sarai and Sarah mean the same thing. It means princess, and I love this, or chieftainess. Woman chief. Just seems to fit for a wife, doesn't it? I mean, it just seems to work. And so in order to avoid some confusion, I'm going to just refer to them as Abraham and Sarah. Even though we'll see in the passages it says Abram, it's the same person. God just changes the name. We'll see why he changes it, and it'll begin to make a little bit more sense. But this is the exalted father, and which meant nothing to Abram. It meant nothing to him that his name was exalted father. Yet. Now, Abraham's family lived in Ur, which is in southern Mesopotamia. This is the area of the Sumerians. Not the Sumerians, but Sumerians, S-U, Sumerians. And you'll see over on the right, this is Ur over here. This is the, oh, thank you, who's doing that? Pretty cool. I don't know who you are, but you need to take some nerd pills. There we go, there's her. All right, to the right of that is the Persian Sea. So what we're looking at over here is, this is basically where Iraq is, and to the right is Iran. Now, so Abram lives in Ur, and they decide that they're going to, God says, go to Canaan. Well, Canaan is clear over here. This is where Israel is, over here. See Damascus? There's that. See God. Come over here to see the blue thing here, there, right? The river. See the Jordan River? There you go. There's the Jordan River. All right, so that's Israel, and so he tells them to move to Canaan. Well, what they do is they get as far as Haran, and they stop. So now he's living in Haran, and then he moves down. Eventually, God says, "I want you to go to the land that I promised you," which is Israel, and eventually he does take a trip over to Egypt. We'll be taking a look at that later on. So that's Abram's life, basically. Now, you need to understand the Sumerian culture. It's important to understand where Abraham came from. The Sumerian culture, the southern Mesopotamia, this area of Ur, had a number of gods. Remember, I talked about how Ham, Noah's son Ham, developed his lineage, became really kind of a godless lineage. He had the grandson, great-grandson actually, had a great-grandson named Nimrod, who was a warrior and very anti-God, and probably where the Tower of Babel was probably during his time of existence. Very anti-God, very self-obsessed. And that was about the time that they started worshiping, they started creating their own gods. In other words, it was what they wanted to become. Their God became what they wanted to become. So if they felt like they needed to be more moral, then they would name a god after that, and that's the god that they would worship. If they felt like they needed to be more loving, they would name a god, and that would be the god of love, and they would worship that god so that they could become more like that god. You know what? It's very much like America. You want to be wealthy, it becomes your god, and so you kind of worship that so you can become more wealthy, like your god. And that's very much what happens throughout the world. So this area of Samaria was filled with people who had created all their own gods to become like. They wanted to become like these gods. And then from that, there was just kind of natural steps where they began to develop these other gods of what they saw, what they understood to be forces of nature or the supernatural. And so one of the big gods that they had was the moon god. They saw the moon and they would actually worship the moon because they saw this nature, this thing that was always there. It was just like clockwork. It was, and apparently they felt it had some power over them. It seemed to have some power over the ocean and the waves, and you know, the tides in and tides out and all of that stuff. And so they saw something. They didn't understand the principle completely about the seasons, but to them it was the moon. And so they had a god of the moon called Nana. N-A-N-N-A. So for those of you grandmothers who think it's cool to be called Nana, you're a moon god. That's really what it amounts to. And Nana had this moon god had a son called Utu, who was the sun god. And she actually had a daughter named Inanna. But anyway, Nana, this moon god, was the main deity in the Sumerian city of Ur. And this area known as Ur later became known by the Hebrew word, which was, interestingly enough, Sin, S-I-N. The moon god's symbol was the crescent moon. Now look at the area and let that sink in. The crescent. That's where it all started. It was the worship of false gods. On the other hand, Abraham's faith was a little different. We can place Abraham somewhere between 2100 BC to 1800 BC, somewhere in that area. But to put all of that into perspective of when Abraham lived, you need to compare that to those who lived before him. I meant to show you the graph, the timeline graph. I meant to throw that up there, and I forgot to include it in the PowerPoint. But for those of you who remember when we were looking at the timeline, Abraham lived while Shem, Noah's son, was still alive. And Shem, if you'll remember, lived in this area down here. They probably knew each other. It's possible that they knew, or if they didn't know each other directly, certainly they knew each other by, relatives. So in the timeline, here's Noah, and Shem, and then here's Abraham down here, and his life picks up. So their lives crossed. Toward the end of Shem's life, for many years toward the ends of Shem's life, Abraham was alive. I mean, it's that close. It's that tight-knit, the timeline of what's happening here in Genesis. And Abraham knew about God. But what happened, things began to change in this area, in Mesopotamia, in southern Mesopotamia especially, and Abraham was kind of an odd one. Because everybody else was worshiping all these gods. But he had a very unique perspective of the nature and character of God. He knew very well what God can do and what God had done. He knew about that. Had been told, he'd been taught about that. He knew about Noah, his great-great-great-great-grandfather. He knew all of these. He knew who God was. He just didn't know a whole lot about him. There was a learning process in Abraham's life. Abraham's lineage came from Noah through Shem. It was a very devout, faithful lineage. Later on, as we study Abraham, we're going to see that he used two words for God. He used the word El, E-L, and Yahweh. And that is generally expressed in the Old Testament as the word Lord. Capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. Especially in King James. You'll see that when it says Lord in the Old Testament, it's referring to Yahweh or to El. Actually, Jewish tradition forbade them pronouncing the name of God. And so they would substitute the word Adonai, which means Lord. So that's why you see the word Lord. But when you see the word Lord, think, oh, they wrote the word Lord because they didn't want to say the holy name of God, which is the word Yahweh.